Again, in November 1926, Mussolini secured a foothold in Albania with the Pact of Tirana. This was part of his attempt to expand Italian influence into the Balkans, which would be an ongoing theme. The barrier was always France. France, who was beginning to link herself up with Yugoslavia from 1927 onwards. France, who resisted Italian attempts to penetrate below the Sahara in the late 1920s. France, who was, as a democracy, increasingly opposed to fascist Italy. In 1929, Mussolini selected Dino Grandi as his foreign secretary. Grandi would serve for 3 years and followed what appeared to be a new and revolutionary policy, a policy of collaboration with the Western powers. Thus, Italy took part in the Geneva disarmament conferences, she played a role in the League of Nations, and she also took part in the 1930 Naval Disarmament Conference. This appeared to presage a new posture by Italy in international affairs. And Mussolini's foreign minister, Dino Grandi, expressed the public face of that policy to the Chamber of Deputies in March 1931. He defined the Italian foreign policy mission as one of balance and conciliation between peoples, races, different and conflicting ideas. But this was only the public face of Italian policy. And we know this because we have access to a unique documentary source, the hastily scribbled notes prepared by Mussolini's war minister, Pietro Gazzera, who had weekly or fortnightly audiences with the Duce. Thus, from Gazzera's secret notes, and they're extremely difficult to decipher, even to this day, we learn that in August 1929, Mussolini remarked that war would come when Germany was back on its feet and could resolve the issues at the top of its agenda, the Danzig Corridor and Anschluss. We also know that during these years, when Grandi, as he himself put it, was chloroforming the international powers by appearing to collaborate with them, we know that Mussolini expected to complete the encirclement of Yugoslavia by 1934. Then he would be ready to settle accounts with her, and that beyond that, he would then be ready for a general war in 1935 or 1936. So, between 1929 and 1932, then, the public face of Italy was one of collaboration on the international scene. But behind that public face, Mussolini was committing resources to the expansion of the army, particularly, but also of the Navy and of the Air Force, in order to ready the instruments that he would need in order to conduct the wars that he now clearly foresaw would be coming in the 1930s. Again, we have a very enlightening note in Gazzera's records of his meetings with Mussolini, which tells us exactly what Mussolini was doing. On the 29th of January 1931, Gazzera recorded of Mussolini, and these were the Duce's own words, "He will play the pacifist while we prepare." Germany was left alone in 1930 and 31, even though Stresemann had departed from the scene. His successor, Julius Curtius, continued the same line of collaboration with the Western powers. Nonetheless, as the Nazis began their approach to power, which would triumph with Hitler's becoming Chancellor in January 1933, the political winds were blowing in the right direction for Italy. Maxim Litvinov, the Soviet commissar, had an inkling of what might be coming. In January 1932, he asked whether, if Hitler came to power, Italo-German relations would get closer. The answer was that they would. As Hitler approached power and then entered office, Mussolini assumed that Germany would rearm. And one of the keys to his policy in the early to middle 1930s is his expectation, firstly, that that rearmament would happen, and secondly, that it would probably take 8 or 10 years for Germany to assume a dominant military position. This time span was crucial because it would allow Italy at least enough time to keep on equal terms with her former enemy. This was one of Mussolini's great miscalculations. What he did not reckon with, and nor did his advisers, was that German military rearmament would be much swifter and much more extensive than he had thought, and therefore than he and Italy could manage. Once Hitler came to power, there were early messages from the Führer that Italy and Germany would, in his words, march together towards the attainment of fascism. But there were also early signs that Hitler was not to be malleable. Clearly, the nascent Nazi Germany had economic aims in the Balkans. Clearly, it looked ultimately to unfettered rearmament, and Hitler made no secret of the fact that he wished to throw out Chancellor Dollfuss in Austria, the first sign of German ambitions in that area. On the 4th of March 1933, Mussolini unveiled the Four-Power Pact. This was presented to the great powers as everything that they could really wish for, and many historians have been deluded into following their illusions. It was presented as a way of revising Versailles, of discussing disarmament, and of negotiating colonial divisions under the auspices of the League of Nations. This was not what it was intended to do. Covertly, Mussolini intended it as a means of managing staged German rearmaments, staged in such a way that the Western Allied powers would be able to swallow it, but staged also in such a way that it would not escape from Italian control and therefore become too great and too extreme. It was a clever idea, but it failed. And it failed because neither France nor Germany were prepared to agree to it. And indeed, on the 14th of October 1933, Germany withdrew from the League of Nations. With that, the cover was gone, and the attempt to manage German rearmament began to fall apart. In 1934, the pace of German rearmament speeded up. Initially, the Italians thought that it was going to take 5 to 10 years for Hitler to remedy his inferiority, but now they thought that it might only take 4, and that by 1938, a newly militarized Germany would be ready for war. This change in the balance of international power had a number of important consequences for Mussolini and for fascist Italy. The first was that rising German power and the threat that it presented in the Balkans pushed Yugoslavia towards Italy, so that after half a decade of conflict and incipient war, a war which Mussolini was always itching to declare, but which his generals told him was for the moment impossible, in the early 1930s, Yugoslavia began to come to terms with Italy. Secondly, this increased German rearmament pushed France towards Italy, thereby improving her power and thereby improving her position and her ability to achieve her objectives in Europe. Thirdly, it also encouraged Great Britain to look to Italy for collaboration against the rising power of Germany. Against this background, we can look at the first and perhaps greatest, if that word can be used, Italian military adventure of the 1930s, the invasion of Abyssinia, which began on the 3rd of October 1935. Abyssinia had for a long time been in Italian sights, if for no other reason than the desire to avenge the defeat that the Abyssinians, then Ethiopians, had inflicted upon the Italians at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, the worst defeat suffered by a white European army in colonial warfare in the 19th century. As early as 1927, Italy had expressed interests in moving into Abyssinia and ultimately taking control of her. There were encouraging signs from the French, who 3 times in 1931 and 1932 indicated that they were prepared to give Italy a free hand. At that time, Mussolini was not willing to take up this offer because he feared that it was a French trap designed to weaken Italy by engaging her in a distant conflict and so making her vulnerable in Europe. Shortly, though, he was to change his mind. Italy was not free to act in North Africa until January 1932 at the earliest, because it was not until then that the pacification of Libya by Italian troops was finally completed. Once that was so, then Mussolini was free on the North African shore to look elsewhere. As well as revenge, there were powerful economic and social reasons why Abyssinia should be in Italy's sights. A Foreign Office memorandum from the time notes, "It is certain that Abyssinia is the only demographic and economic outlet still left open to us. To penetrate it requires money. To take it, probably war." There was a further reason to focus on Abyssinia in the early 1930s, and that was that the French, the much feared and greatly disliked French, were stirring things up. News came to Rome that France was supplying aircraft to Abyssinia and improving her military position. There was, in Italian circles at this time, what seems to be a genuine, if misplaced, fear that a reviving Abyssinia, one in which the authority of Haile Selassie and the ability of centralized power to direct the affairs of the country were increasing, a fear that a revived Abyssinia represented a real military threat to Italy. It did not, but that is how it seemed to some people in Rome at least, and there's no reason to suppose that that was not a genuine, if misplaced, perception at the heart of the Roman Empire. Finally, one should add a pressure that's familiar to historians who cover the development of the British and other empires in the late 19th century, and that is local forward pressure by administrators on the spot. The Italian governors of Somalia and Eritrea had been pressing ever since 1923 to expand into what they called Ethiopia and what we call Abyssinia. All these pressures and all these threads came together for the first time on the 29th of November 1932. It was then that the first war plan was drawn up. At this time, 3 things held Mussolini back from activating it and from starting a war in Abyssinia. First, the army was not yet prepared. "We could fight them now," Mussolini remarked, "but the game is not worth the candle." Secondly, at this time, 1932-1933, the complications of the European situation suggested that a war might break out there, and so fighting in Abyssinia was not the best of ideas. Thirdly, in 1932, the state was still in considerable financial disarray and simply could not afford a war at this time. However, a little over a year later, at the beginning of 1934, Mussolini saw things slightly differently. If things are quiet in Europe, then it was recorded he would like to carry out the operation in 1935.